Good afternoon, everybody. This is Tulani Bridgewater Kowalski joining you here from my home during the pandemic. And I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Gina Paige of African Ancestry, also AfricanAncestry.com. And as I was telling Gina before we went live, that I am so excited because she's essentially kicking off Black History Month, at least for me. And we'll talk a little bit more about the significance of that and the work that she does. But before we go any further, I want to say welcome, Gina. And I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Well, I put some red lipstick on in honor of your beautiful mother, and I realized that I didn't make sure my teeth aren't red. But anyway, I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Tulani. And, in a nutshell, I'm a pioneer. I am the only person in the world that does what I do. I am the co-founder and CEO of AfricanAncestry.com, and we pioneered genetic ancestry tracing for Black people around the world. And we did that because we want to use DNA to help Black people transform the way they view themselves, or the way we view ourselves, actually, and the way we view Africa. And we believe very strongly that knowing where you're from in Africa, exactly where you're from, not a region, not some percentage, but a place and a people, is critical to knowing who you are. And it really does support that Sankofa principle that you have to go back and fetch it so that your path forward will be, in my own words, more fulfilling and more meaningful. And so that's what I've spent the past 18 years of my life doing. And I'm more than that, but that's why I'm here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and just so that anyone who's watching us understands, this is not a small endeavor. Not only have you been doing this work for 18 years, not including the time leading up to preparing to launch this company, but it's global. And I think from the figures that are on your website, 750,000 people have used AfricanAncestry.com. So it's had a tremendous impact, and it has an ongoing impact. And I think you really talked about that in a small way when describing your work, but it really is about connecting people who, maybe we've simply lost that information. Maybe it wasn't transferred from generation to generation. Maybe a person is adopted. Maybe you just want to know more specific details. But I think when you start talking about African Americans, it also tries to kind of respond to a lot of work that as individuals is placed upon us to try to reconnect with something essential about who we are. And you also mentioned on the website, this is both a genetic discovery, but it's also a historical, emotional, psychological, spiritual. It's a holistic journey that each person embarks on for whatever reason. And you, through African ancestry, not only because you understand it personally and you've traveled the world, and we got to talk about that a little bit as well. But you also can understand as an African American how critically important that is.
Yeah.
So,
I was going to say, I was thinking about how I could talk about this differently, Tulani, since I feel very honored to be on your show. And one way I think is important to look at it, or for people to really get it, is, especially as Black people, but all people, we go through life with issues. Mm-hmm. But as Black folks, I'm going to talk about Black folks because that's who we are in the business of serving. I'm in the business of being Black. We have feelings of maybe we aren't Black enough, or people don't think that we're from Africa, or we have to work harder. We have to be smarter. We are inherently not good at math or science. Like, there are all these stereotypes that we're only good at dancing and entertaining. There are all these stereotypes that are placed on us layer by layer by layer, generation by generation by generation. And they are dictated by the fact that we are of African descent. But then, if you look like me and you, then there's a whole nother layer when it comes to skin color. There may be another layer based on socioeconomics. And so we succumb to that because that's all we know. We can't say, well, you know what? You're wrong because my people were on the Amistad, or you're wrong because my people had printing before the appearance of or presence of Europeans, or you're wrong because in ancient Kemet, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And what African Ancestry does is it provides a connection so that you have a sense of place, you have a sense of pride, and you have a sense of belonging. So when you are hit with all these stereotypes and all this negativity, you can just, it's like an armor. It's just gonna bounce off of you.
Well, and so that's 100%. I think that, and I've lived in France for a while and across Europe, that is something that is common amongst people who didn't immigrate by will, or people who were a part of a colonial system like we are, here in the States, but also the sort of effect that it has on the African continent. But it's also, it's like you said, it's reframing Africa and our connection to Africa, because a lot of people treat Africa like it's one place. First of all, it's not one place. They're like, Africa, in quotes. And it's, there are myriad cultures, there are myriad countries, there are ethnic groups, there are languages, there are economies, there are modern, incredible cities that are at the forefront of, architectural and infrastructure development. And that gets lost most of the time because people have it's what the media and what the political agenda have fed to the public about Africa. And we internalize that. And I know that I personally, so Gina and her company did African Ancestry search for my mother, Dee Bridgewater, who also was on the show. And you came in with your team and you did a reveal. And it was in New York City a few years ago. And my mother made sure that all 3 of her kids were there. So we got to participate in it. It was done at the Blue Note Jazz Club. And when you revealed the results and we were all there, it was this kind of strange aha moment. Growing up American, Black American, if you're really fortunate, a lot about your family history. We didn't. So the thing that you gave to us through African Ancestry was a sense of place. It was a sense of connection. It also allowed us to start looking in the right place to find out more about our ancestral lineage. It gave us an opportunity to start connecting dots that we didn't even know existed, but there were answers that we could then turn to and start reformulating how we think about ourselves and the way that we live in the world. And then for me, it allows me to give that gift to my children. Right. So all of a sudden I can recreate a legacy that I can then pass on intergenerationally. And I think that's something that is, they joke about it. It truly is priceless. And there's there have been waves of this acknowledgement and recognition that have come over the intervening years that have radically influenced my life. And I can imagine that's the case for everyone who comes to African Ancestry, right?
That's what we hear. And, people say it in different ways. You're the first person to say radically, and I love that. I was getting chills just remembering that night when you just were describing it. I didn't even see you and your siblings because you guys were like off on the stairs or something. You were way out of my view. But I do remember, first of all, your mother's reaction, because I think she really wanted to be from Mali, and I really wanted her to be from Mali. And when I said Fulani, she was like, ah! But then subsequently did the research that the Fulani were in Mali too. And so there was that kind of connection that was very powerful. And I think you have experienced it in a very meaningful way because you have lived outside of the United States. And so you've actually had to reckon with your identity as an American.
Yeah.
And then as a Black American, which I think is something that the average Black person doesn't have to do. The other thing I wanted to just point out is that not only does it transform the way and reframe the way we view Africa, but it's a two-way street. So it's also enabling us to help Africans reframe the way they see us in the diaspora. And that's just as important because they're getting all of the same negative stereotypes about us that we're getting about ourselves and that we're getting about them. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we are now creating another channel, a bridge that the diaspora can walk across and that Africa can walk across, and we meet.
Absolutely. So I'd love to ask, because the part of this work is that you actually had to go around the world and collect DNA samples in some way so that you could have, so first of all, if you could just explain, this is very specific. So when you go to other DNA companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and there are a lot of them, and they all have value and they all serve different purposes for everyone's life. So it's not that they're not good. They're definitely great. And I have friends who've used them. And sometimes they're used in tandem with AfricanAncestry.com. But what has been really frustrating, I think, particularly for friends of mine and family members, is that they can't get the specifics. It's like you said, they'll say X% of sub-Saharan. Well, that's, a tremendously huge.
You don't need DNA to tell you that. You already know that you come from West Africa.
Yeah, when I look in the mirror brushing my teeth, I can draw that conclusion.
Yeah.
So, but you guys provide specificity at a level that I don't think anyone else possibly can. So I'd love to know a little bit of how you do that.
Okay, so I'll take a step back by saying we don't look at all of your DNA. We only look at DNA that is specific to your mother and her mother and her mother and her mother, or we look at DNA that men have that's specific to their father and father and father and father. All the companies pretty much work the same way scientifically. We take your DNA from a swab or your saliva, and we unlock the code, a specific code, and then we look for other people around the world who share that same code. And if you share the same code, you have to share some sort of ancestry. If you're European and you're looking for your European ancestry, then you would want your code to be compared to as many Europeans as possible, right? If you're looking for Native American ancestry, you want your DNA to be compared to the DNA from as many Native Americans as possible. You want the pool as big as it can get. Well, we have the largest pool, the largest database of indigenous African lineages in the world, African codes. And so we have over 33,000 genetic samples from Africans. Our closest colleague in the industry doesn't even have 2,000. So when you're looking for an African answer and you want your DNA to be compared to the people in our database, because there's just more chances for you to find a match. And in our database, we've segmented the continent by country, not by region, like our colleagues, by present day country, and by ethnic group or tribe. So like we told Chadwick Boseman, may he rest in power, he shares maternal ancestry with the Limba people living in Sierra Leone. If you've taken an Ancestry.com test or a 23andMe.com test, they don't even have Sierra Leone in their database. So you're not going to get that match. And we also hear people who say, oh yeah, I took that test and I found out that I'm 35% Cameroon. But what actually they found out was they don't just say Cameroon. They combine Cameroon with the Congo. So now it's gotten even bigger. And then Southern Bantu people. Well, I mean, that's half of Africa, right? Yeah. So that's how we're different. We're much more specific. And we did that purposely because we wanted to tell people who were disconnected, that look like us, where they were from before the transatlantic slave trade. So we're just going back 500 to 2,000 years. We're not going all the way back to Lucy or mitochondrial Eve. We're all African in that sense. Right. But we're looking at a specific time period to meet, to your point, a very specific psychological, social, cultural need.
Absolutely. So, the funny thing, when you bring it back to America, because it's not that we're special per se, but we have sort of a unique condition in the United States with being a Black American that is uncommon outside of the US. And a lot of it's good, a lot of it's really bad. But one of the common things that I know we all struggle with, particularly when you start to get into colorism and you start to get into the affect of slavery and the intermingling of people, and then now also since loving and it's legal to actually intermarry interracially, there's also a shift in our DNA, and I'll put it that way. But for someone of my generation and a little bit older, especially when we started going through the civil rights movement, being a Black American could mean so many things. And you touched upon it with Black enough. And I know that in my family, we cover every color. And so
you guys are a real rainbow. You're a chocolate rainbow.
we cover everything. And the irony is that it always was very difficult for me to feel justified in saying that I was African American, because I didn't have a sufficient connection to Africa, and I couldn't name it and I couldn't place it. And then it's later, and this is my drama. This isn't anybody else's drama. It's not a universal thing. But then you layer in, I'm fairer or paler than my sister and my mother. Not than my dad, but he's done his own DNA research. So we got some answers over there. But this allowed me to say, no, actually, I am an African American. And I know specifically from where, and I know from what. And of course, the big joke of that evening was that I'm Tulani of the Fulani. And so I'm like, you even gave me the name. And then we subsequently found out that my name is actually, my middle name is Yoruban. So we're like, we joke that there must have been something inside my parents that was calling to them, because my first and middle names are both African. And they relate directly to who we are and the tribes that we come from. But there are also different characteristics about being African American versus being Black that kind of, they're equal in the sense that they are who we are. But it's sort of the only comparison I can give is that when you're talking to people, we're accustomed to the conversation with European Americans. I'm Irish and therefore X. I'm Scottish and therefore X. My people are German and therefore X. We now get to have the therefore that we never really got to have without your work.
You know what that reminds me of? There's this phenomenal boy and his little sister in Dallas, Tulani. His name is Julian, and he has a business called the Step Stool Chef. And he teaches kids how to be comfortable in the kitchen. And I met him because he was so excited. He kept asking his mother, can we find out where we're from? Can we find out where we're from? Because at his multicultural school, they have International Day, and there's one day where they put this huge world map up and have every kid put a pin in the country that they come from. And he said to me, I didn't know where to put the pin.
Yeah.
So then when he found out he was from people living in Cameroon, the T-Car people in Cameroon, he then said, actually, we found him in the T-Car in Cameroon and the Booby in Bioko Island. He said, now I can put 2 pins in the map.
Yeah.
And his whole countenance was just brighter. So it affects us even as little kids. We don't even have to be in the workplace or in college. It happens in elementary school.
Absolutely. And it's this conversation that we don't even realize we're not having with ourselves, or that we're having in the background with ourselves. So thank you, because I mean, to have that pin, he is absolutely on point with all of that. So there's another element about this that is really, I think, important, which is that you're a woman co-founding, leading a company that is at the forefront of essentially biotech. That's not a small feat, and that's certainly not a small feat for an African-American woman. And so I'd like us to give some time to that and how you came to come to this field and your experience in it. This is big. It's a big deal.
Well, when you put it like that, my approach to African ancestry, I call it my African ancestry experience, really from a biotech path. So I'm a business person. I have a bachelor's in economics from Stanford. I have an MBA from the University of Michigan. And I spent almost 10 years with corporations like Colgate-Palmolive, pushing Palmolive dish liquid, and Sara Lee Bakery, where I was the pie queen. And I just always wanted to work for myself and market to Black people. That's what I wanted to do. And so when I met Dr. Kittles, who is my co-founder and business partner, he had the research because not all, but he from childhood was like, why do people look different? Why do people act different? And he became interested in where he was from and used that to fuel his research. And so he was really just answering the question for himself. Where did I come from? And the community found, it's a long story, but New York African Burial Ground, the community found out. Howard switchboard, he was at Howard at the time, their switchboard got overwhelmed. And he then realized, I can't do this for people. I'm just a researcher. I can't do this for everybody who's calling. So when we were introduced, for me, it was the perfect, really storm in a positive way. It was the perfect storm of using my skills and talents that I and my parents had invested in to market something that has never existed before. Before February 21st, 2003, if you were Black, you just had to guess where you were from, unless you were Alex Haley or, you were some miracle that had it passed down. Yeah. And then to be able, so a marketer's dream, that's a marketer's dream. There's no new dish liquid. There's no new dessert, but this was brand new. And then to do it for myself and for a group of people that I'm passionate about was just, so that's how I got here from the business side of it. And then I just learned enough science to be dangerous.
Yeah. That's like the perfect way to describe it.
Don't ask me about anything except this. I got you on this. Okay, but it is tremendous because there are other women who have these types of companies, but we're just all different, and there is while Rick, my partner, is Black, he's a man and he's a scientist and he doesn't deal in the day-to-day. So I do often feel, I'm going to say a unicorn because that's a popular term and it's very positive. One day I was like, oh, I am a unicorn. But what I really have felt like for much of the 18 years is that I didn't have a tribe. Because I have friends who are entrepreneurs, but it's a very different, it just depends on the business that you're in, which is why I created the business of being Black. In creating that, I was able to pull in other people and create my own tribe.
That makes perfect sense. And I think that's, first of all, that speaks obviously to the Woolfer community because we're essentially we created a tribe of women of a certain age group and interests and so forth. But I think that's something that is also challenging when you're a pioneer. It's like that joke of, unless you're the lead dog, the view never changes. Well, they don't talk about the fact that when you're the lead dog, you don't know what's going on behind you all the time. And it feels like you're all by yourself out there. So you have to kind of have an internal propulsion mechanism and a drive. And of course, no one goes anywhere alone. We all, whether it's direct or indirect, we all have a support team, kind of scaffolding us, to use the language of now. But, to have a company for 18 years that is so specific and so really tailored for a unique demographic, you have a built-in audience, kind of, sort of, but I would imagine from a marketing standpoint, it's great. And it's also a bit of a challenge to make sure that you get the message out. We exist. This is what we do. You are our customer, client, partner, et cetera. And so I can imagine that's also not an easy task.
Girl, no. How'd you know? It's not. So at the beginning, this is my African ancestry experience. Again, I just keep going back to that. In the beginning, we had to prove our validity and prove our credibility to Black folks and to the mainstream community that didn't want us to exist. Because see, the people who didn't want us to exist, they know where they're from.
Right.
And they know where we're from. And they know the power in that identity, right? So at first it was like, okay, yeah, we're a small business, but we are doing this, and no one else can do it, but we can. So we were building our credibility. Then as our credibility started to build, we're self-funded. Let me also put that up there for everybody watching and listening. We've never had any investors. We've been our own investors, and we started with $1,200 and a database. So every kit had to pay for itself. Our colleagues, they may not have still not have a profit, because they've had so much investment that they've been able to try stuff and fall and stumble. We never had that luxury. Okay, so then we're trying to talk to Black folks who have been told all their lives, Africa's terrible, Africa's horrible, I'm not African. So we had to deal with that psychology. Then we had to deal with the psychology of, I'm not giving you my DNA. Kind of like where we are today, right? We've kind of gone from there to the same place. What are you going to use my DNA? So we had to deal with all of that, and we got through it. And then once we got through it, the other colleagues started seeing us, and they started then saying, oh, okay, we can do this for Black people. We can tell Black people where they're from. And they never could, and were never thinking about us. So now you've got the industry, millions of dollars of advertising being poured into the industry, so much so that people think now we have to prove that we don't do what the other people do when we were doing it first. And yeah, ours cost more because we're doing something so different. Like what you're paying $99 for or $49 for is really, you're paying them to give you information that's not helpful about your African ancestry. Let me be clear. And the ability to use your DNA into perpetuity.
Yes.
So when you come to us, you pay more, but you get an answer that you can relate to, and your DNA gets destroyed.
See, and that's, I mean, especially in the United States, where building trust with the Black community on anything related to medical stuff is just so fraught. And for people who don't know the history, I mean, all you have to do is, look at the Tuskegee experiment and Henrietta Lacks. If you just only touch on those two things, it'll reveal a lot to you. And so to build trust, and just because you're a Black person doesn't mean that Black people are going to trust you. So let's just write that off. You know what I mean?
and they actually may be more likely to not trust you, quite honestly.
Well, because I mean, the character was that Uncle Ruckus existed for a reason in Boondocks. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So, because there is a lot of, I mean, we can get into the whole systemic historic thing. I mean, there has to be a certain level of distrust in ourselves in order for certain systems to persist. And part of that is going to be about doubting one another and doubting ourselves, which relies a lot on the disconnectedness from who we are and where we come from. So the irony is, I mean, I could see how there's perceived to be a little bit of danger in people reconnecting with who they are and where they're from. That's misguided, because really whole, happy, cohesive, coherent communities, it's been shown economically, education-wise, I mean, things improve radically and can happen very quickly when communities start to be whole again. And so by making an individual whole, that radiates out, and then the community can be whole. And all of a sudden, some of these seemingly insurmountable problems can actually be at least addressed. I'm not a complete Pollyanna.
Right. Well, and then there's the fact that, so there's an elder who's now an ancestor, Nana, Dr. Patricia Newton, and she taught that the trauma in general lasts for 7 generations. She's a psychiatrist who spent her career studying people of African descent and Africans. And so if it lasts for 7 generations, we're still dealing with the trauma of the period of slavery in the Americas. And so that just feeds into what you were saying about how we can't see ourselves as whole.
No.
But not everybody, but the people who stop, take the time and do the work, as they say, I'm sorry. I
That's
hit do not
okay.
disturb, but it still disturbs me. People who do the work, do the work with
Yeah,
themselves and their families. And even if you don't do DNA, but research your family tree like your family has done, Tulani, and learn about where you come from, we can stop that trauma. We can
absolutely.
stop it so it doesn't keep going for another 7 generations.
Yeah. Well, and I know that for my mother, she did this for herself. She did it for her children. It had the unintended consequence of me being able to give it to my children and them being able to pass it on and so forth. And so and like you said, that is definitely doing part of the work, but it also is a portal to being able to do the work. Because
Mm,
when you're operating in a void, when there's some critical fundamental part of yourself that you can't access, it's really hard. And I think that goes to the whole bootstrapping mentality. Well, you can only
yeah,
pull up your bootstraps if you have boots. And our folks haven't really had boots to pull straps up on. So this is
right.
one critical component to that. And obviously it's not something that everyone needs to undertake necessarily, but those of us who feel like it's important, I really think could benefit from it. And I love what you said about you pay a little more, but hey, we destroy your DNA, because I know for the majority of people, the concept that your genetic material is just released into the wild, and you don't know what's going to happen with it, is frankly terrifying. It's why I have not done any of the others. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that specifically, because I know that's a huge question.
Yeah, it is. It is. But
Yeah.
and what I tell people is that people who want to take our test,
Hmm.
but they, like you said, they have very valid concerns like you have to consider that you've given blood and you never asked where it went.
Yeah.
You've given urine and you never asked what lab it was going to. And that's because the value of the information that is derived from that blood and that urine was worth it to you. It was
Right.
so important to you that you didn't think, where's it going to go?
Yeah.
Well, if the value of knowing where in Africa you come from or where your ancestor was before the slave trade is high enough, then you should be
Mhm.
willing to use our test, knowing that you have that safety net that we aren't going to sell or share. We wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be talking to you right now if we sold or shared our customers' DNA. We wouldn't have lasted a year.
Well, no,
Just wouldn't have happened.
I can imagine. Well, I think what another interesting thing that you mentioned is, now your colleagues, who are actually your competitors, are trying to get in on your business.
I was trying to use a nice word
I
instead
know
of
I can say it because I'm not you, so my official capacity is not compromised. But I think that it's interesting. I mean, it's frustrating on one hand because you've done all of this work and effort, and it's flattering because, hey, they like what you're doing. But also, I think it speaks to kind of the power of what is shifting in our culture, that we have value.
yeah,
So in a way, all of the hard work that you have put in is benefiting everyone, because if all of a sudden, hey, you know what, this is a market. This is a market that will yield financial reward. It'll give us, credibility, a little bit of prestige, or whatever it is, the thinking behind it. The end result is, hopefully, there's going to be a wider breadth of services to Black
yeah,
people
yeah,
globally.
yeah.
So, I also love that you guys have been doing this on your own, because there's nothing to put pressure to compromise than having someone's money. Like, it's a short-term fix, but it can provide long-term headaches.
We have avoided that like the plague for a few reasons. One, we want to stay Black owned. And so,
Yeah,
we can't go through, of course, there are Black investors and,
sure.
one day we may entertain them. But the other thing was just the amount of, and to your point, it was kind of selfish on my part, the amount of reporting that I would have to do and the level of scrutiny and just all of that just was never very attractive to me. But it is how you grow. And I mean, we've grown, but our growth really came as a result of Black Panther. That's when we really saw our company explode in a positive way. And it was because I think it was a perfect storm. So that was the year that wasn't that the year that Trump took office in 2018, or was that 2019? No, Trump, it wasn't the year he took office, but he was in office. Trump was in office.
Okay.
Chadwick Boseman shouted us out on The Breakfast Club, which is a very popular radio show that is syndicated and is video too. And he did it the week of the release of the movie.
Okay.
And then we had the movie, which made everybody around the world proud to be African. And so those three factors, being fed up with Trump and then having Chadwick and Black Panther, just really helped boost us, of course. So he was really our investor in a non-monetary way.
And you've since, and I could go on and talk about Chadwick and all of his work, Black Panther, what it meant to me, how I want to live in Wakanda, but you've also, your company has worked with a lot of really prominent families. So I know the King family. I mean, if you could just give people an idea of some of the more known, if you're allowed to say.
Yeah, I can. So I can say, so everything's completely confidential. And the only reason I can say these is because they've given us permission. So the King family, we trace the ancestry of Coretta Scott King to the Mende people of Sierra Leone. We trace the paternal ancestry of Martin Luther King because we used his son. And that went back to European countries, but they already knew that from their genealogy research. I didn't know that, but they knew that. It's so funny, Tulani. I feel like I'm just like we're having wine, but I was doing a reveal at a mosque, the Nation's Mosque here in Washington, D.C. And I said that about Martin Luther King, and the little boy at the end, he asked a question. He said, "Did you just say Martin Luther King was white?" Because he couldn't, but that was the natural. Yeah. That's not what I said, but yeah. Let's see, the Jackson family. So Jesse Jackson and his family. But you know, if we just stay in politics, Dr. Dorothy Height, and it's Black History Month, right? Honorable Andrew Young, and there was one other person I was thinking of on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, so you know, and then it goes across the arts and entertainment and sports, and that really has been the core of what's helped us. The very first notable person who took our test was LeVar Burton.
Oh, how much do we love?
Because I was like, shouldn't Kunta Kinte know where he's from? They were calling us a modern day Ruth. And so we reached out to him and he agreed and he took the test. So it's been the generosity of spirit, like people like your mother and others who have allowed us to gift them with a test, but also who have shared the answer with people. Those are our investors, really. Those are our investors.
Absolutely. Well, I want to I know we're going to be running out of time. I'm going to quickly tell you a story that's not, it speaks to your Martin Luther King thing. It speaks to everything. My dad did, I think it was Ancestry.com, because it was before he'd heard of African ancestry, and he got his results back. And we're all waiting. The whole family is waiting, you know, this is it. And he calls me and the first thing he says is, "T, are you sitting down?" And I'm like, I'm thinking he's having a health issue. I'm like, what is it? He's like, "I got my results back from Ancestry." I'm like, okay. And he goes, "I'm white." Because they didn't trace the African ancestry, and they specifically looked through all the European ancestry. And he joked, because my dad's a jazz musician, we had running jokes about how we were going to take his horn away. They were going to kick him out of the jazz club, you know. But he was legitimately traumatized.
He's and it's traumatic. It is.
Yeah, because he's cheeky, Afro, Black Power, you know, played with Max Roach for 20 some odd years. I mean, he's generations all in. So Yeah, he was. So when he found out, he goes, and my parents have been divorced since forever. He's like, of course your mother would figure it out before me, you know? So I think
But
he's going to be doing his.
that's funny. It's funny, but it's not funny, because what's important, I should also note, is that we can't guarantee that the result will be African.
Oh,
because
yeah.
we're all mixed. And if we just look at it as we each have 4 grandparents, right? There are many more greats, but if we just stop at 4 grandparents, one African ancestry test only looks at one of these 4 grandparents.
Right.
Woo. So when we look at the maternal grandmother, 92% of the time that comes back African.
Okay.
But when we look at the paternal grandfather, the father's line, 30% of the time, that's European. Because white men, slaveholders, slave traders, and other men who made their living in the system of enslavement of Black people, they were fathering brown babies with enslaved women. This is before it was legal. It was before it could be love, right? And so we see, and when a Portuguese slaveholder fathers a son with an enslaved, let's say, Angolan woman, the son is Black, whether he looks like you and me or whether he looks like Wesley Snipes. And he's going to have Black sons who have Black sons who have Black sons, because we live in a one-drop rule world.
Yeah.
But the DNA is going back to Portugal. So that everybody who takes, every Black person who takes the Ancestry.com test gets some percentage European ancestry, and on average it's 25%.
Lord have mercy, such a tangled web.
Yep.
Such a tangled web. All right. Well, is there anything else that we didn't get to talk about? Because this has been so much fun. I feel like it is like having
I know. I'm like, shoot, where's the wine glass? I probably wouldn't be this coherent though if we were drinking. So,
well, thankfully, dry
I
January is over.
Oh yeah, true. Okay, I'll call you back after this, and we'll have some more. I think we've touched on it. The things that people are most concerned about is the security of their genetic information. We don't sell or share it. We destroy it. Why should I do it? Why is it important? And the reason it's important, Tulani, besides everything we've already said, is that we come from somewhere, and we come from someone. And don't you want your great grandchildren to know who you are? We owe it to ourselves to know who those women were who came before us. And while we can't tell you her name, unfortunately, we can't tell you where she lived, we can tell you where she lived. We can't tell you what she did or how she contributed to the community, but we can tell you where she lived and what their spiritual practices were, and their beliefs and their traditions and their customs, and all of those things that we're going to see in ourselves at some point. And so that's why you should do it, because you can, and you should honor yourself and your ancestors.
I totally 100% agree. So for everyone who's watching, please visit AfricanAncestry.com, excuse me. You can find them easily on the internet. You can search for the socials as well. It's African Ancestry. Everything's super straightforward and easy. You can also follow Gina Paige on Instagram. So
I'm Gina Paige DNA.
Yes.
Gina
also
Paige DNA.
And you have a beautiful Instagram feed. I'm very envious.
I have to thank you.
That. Yeah, I'm like, I'm all over the place, very scattershot. So, but thank you so much for explaining this. Thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. And I'm just wishing you continued success. I tell people about you all the time. Thank you. I just thank you for the gift that you gave to me and my family, because can't put a price tag on it. I feel blessed.
And it was a blessing and an honor to be able to do that. So
thank you so much. All right, well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us at the Woolfer. Come check us out, check Gina out, check African Ancestry out.